Good afternoon or good evening, depending where you are, to ASAP, Association of Student Activism for Palestine. Gives me a great pleasure today to be to introduce a very renowned speaker and a scholar on the issue of Palestine. This is, of course, Israeli Apartheid Week, and today we have Hazem Jamjoum. He's a doctoral candidate at Modern Middle East History at New York University. He was one of the organizers of the first Israeli Apartheid Week in Toronto in 2005. So that is really a great honor to be with an individual who started something that we are now all being actively engaged in, and something that brings to the fore the issue of Palestine. He's also the communication officer of Badil Resource Centre for Refugees Rights in Bethlehem in Palestine. So Hazem, welcome to Israeli Apartheid Week, and on behalf of the Association of Students for Activism for Palestine, thank you for joining us. Today's programs, my friends, will be, Hazem will hopefully give us a 15-20 minute perspective on Israeli Apartheid concept and ideas. And thereafter, we will ask him some questions, and you are all free to submit your questions. Whichever platform you're on, please write down your questions, which I'll put to Hazem at the end of his presentation. So Hazem, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours for the next 15-20 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Patel. Thank you, Ismail. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. I will try to keep this as brief as possible. Apartheid. Oftentimes when people try to talk about Israel as an apartheid state, what they think they're doing is carrying out a comparison with apartheid South Africa. Apartheid is an Afrikaner word, so this is the kind of the Dutch settler colonists in South Africa, and it's a word that means apartness. In 1948, when their nationalist party won the elections, they instituted a set of highly discriminatory laws that we came to associate with the notion of apartheid and South Africa as an apartheid regime. This word came to be kind of synonymous with that regime, and in the 1970s, apartheid actually became an internationally defined crime. So in the mid-1970s, after the Soweto massacre, the kind of international community came together in something called the International Declaration for the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, and defined apartheid as, kind of to put it simply, if a state commits a human rights violation, so violates the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so anything that's listed in there, in the context of trying to establish or maintain a regime of racial domination by one group over another group or other groups, this is the crime of apartheid. So again, let's kind of simplify this. If we can establish that a state is trying to create or already has and is trying to maintain a regime where one group is to be held as dominant over all the other groups, or any other group, and in this context commits any human rights violation, any one of a singular act, then this is apartheid. In the case of Israel, we actually have ample documentation that the state of Israel violates all of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Every single item that's on there, from the denial of return to unlawful kind of incarceration to denial of life and liberty, and so on. So you can go read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I challenge you to find one thing in there that Israel does not commit. The question becomes, does it do so in the context of trying to, at this point, maintain a regime of domination by one group over other group? And this is actually very straightforward to demonstrate. If we look at all of the kind of correspondence and documentation of the Zionist movement before the establishment of the State of Israel, and Israel's own documentation since its establishment in 1948, what we find is a movement that was created to establish a state exclusively for the Jewish people. And here, Jewish isn't actually a religious identity necessarily. Jewish in this context, in the context of Zionism, and especially in the context of the State of Israel, is a legal category. So it's not Jewish people, it's who the State of Israel defines under its own laws to be Jewish. And let me kind of just give an example to illustrate this more clearly. in the 1990s, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, many people were trying to leave the Soviet Union, Jewish and non-Jewish. And many of the non-Jewish Christians who found out that if they could get documentation that would prove enough that they were Jewish to fit Israeli law, that they could then claim Israeli nationality and citizenship, so Jewish nationality and therefore Israeli citizenship. Israel is one of the only countries that makes a distinction between citizenship and nationality. And so Jewish is the way that they define nationality for its Jewish citizens. And so many of these Christians migrated to Palestine, became Israeli citizens as Jewish nationals legally, but they were Christian and they actually now have churches. But the Israeli law defines them as Jews. So this is why I'm trying to say it's not about how you worship or your relationship to religion. It's about how you fit into Israeli law. The other thing that we find is that the way that this understanding of how to create a Jewish state, and then it becomes the formulation Jewish and democratic state in Palestine, was effectively can be summarized in one sentence, which is that the Zionist movement aimed to create a situation where the maximum amount of land in and around Palestine came under exclusive Jewish control, with the minimum number of non-Jews, which is effectively the indigenous people, the Palestinians, with the minimum number of Palestinians on that land. So maximum land, minimum Palestinians. And if we understand this, it actually kind of summarizes, it can help you understand and explain most of the activities of how Israeli settler colonialism in Palestine has worked. Institutionally, this is also interesting to look at because very soon after 1897, when the World Zionist Organization was established, the World Zionist Organization itself established two arms that were related to that goal of maximum land, minimum Palestinians. The first of these arms was the Keren Kayemet LeIsrael, which they translated in English as the Jewish National Fund. And the Jewish National Fund was the arm responsible for the land side of the equation. So we have two sides of the equation, the land side and the demography, population side. For the land side, the Jewish National Fund was established actually in London, and in its bylaws was very clear that any land that the Jewish National Fund acquired, however it acquired it, was to be used exclusively for Jewish settlement, and that any land that it acquired was not to be sold. It could only be traded in for more land or more valuable land, and that this was land to be held in the name of the Jewish people in perpetuity, forever. And again, Jewish being this kind of legal category. And it's important for people in the UK and in many countries around the world to know about the Jewish National Fund, because after 1948, in the 1950s, the Jewish National Fund rebranded itself as an environmental organization that plants trees and does water treatment. Meanwhile, what it actually does, even though it does plant trees and it does treat water, its primary function is actually to uphold the system of apartheid in land. And if you have questions about this, it requires a longer explanation than I have time for right now. But you can look up Yuri Davis's book, Apartheid Israel, Possibilities for the Struggle Within, for a very detailed description of how the Jewish National Fund is the kind of fundamental cornerstone of how apartheid in land works in Israeli law. Just to say that in those 50 years approximately in which the Jewish National Fund was trying to acquire land in Palestine, it was only able to acquire 6.7% of the land, it and other Zionist organizations, actually. So on the eve of the 1948 establishment of the State of Israel, the Zionist movement and its institutions was only in control of less than 7% of the land. Palestinians and Palestinian institutions and Palestinian communities controlled over 91% of the land, right? In terms of the demographic aim, the kind of maximum Jewish people, minimum Palestinian people, the main institution founded for this became known as the Jewish Agency. And this institution was set up to convince generally white Jews, so Jews from Europe and North America, because this was very much a white supremacist movement, demonstrably so. And so they tried to convince white Jewish people from Europe and North America to migrate to Palestine, or what they called ascend, make aliyah to Palestine, continue to call this. And the Jewish Agency still exists, and this is still its task. And so to also kind of like recruit people, convince them, often using tactics in which they tried to tell people that they were being bad Jews if they didn't make the migration to Palestine. And to facilitate this by kind of helping with logistics, expenses, paperwork, helping find housing upon arrival, find work upon arrival. And initially, you have these kind of waves of migration between the 1890s and the mid-1900s. The first kind of couple of waves end up, this is mostly people from the Eastern Europe and what becomes the Soviet Union. These kind of fail because people then remigrate elsewhere. By the end of the 1920s, the British, Britain is an occupying power in Palestine in the 1920s, 30s, and most of the 40s after World War I. And so they do a census at the end of the 20s in which no more than 60 to 80,000 of the population are Jewish migrants. It takes, one of the great and terrible cataclysms of human history, which is the Nazi Shoah and the genocide of Gypsies, communists, and of course, Jewish people in Europe, to create a mass migration of over 500,000 Jews to Palestine. That brings it to the number that's on the screen right now, which is that in 1947, you have just over 600,000 Jews. And remember, we had only 60 to 80,000 at the end of the 1920s. By 1947, it's up to 600,000. But this is still only 1/3 of the population. So let's recap. By 1947, just before the State of Israel is established, the Zionist movement controls less than 7% of the land and 1/3 of the population. And let's remember that most of this population isn't there for Zionist ideology. The vast majority are there as refugees from the Holocaust. And so this is not necessarily an ideologically committed population yet at this point. But it's a big failure, is kind of ultimately what I'm saying. The Zionist movement was aiming for maximum land, minimum Palestinians. They had a tiny fraction of the land and a minority of the population. And so how to change this into a Jewish state, one in which these Jewish institutions, Zionist institutions, controlled most of the land and most of the population? And the answer was to expel the indigenous population, expel the non-Jews, expel the Palestinians. And so from the end of 1947 and into 1949, and then for all the years since then, all of the policies of what became the State of Israel in 1948 have been about the forced displacement of Palestinians off of their lands. And this begins with the major kind of systematic effort to forcibly expel the majority of Palestine's population outside the borders of Palestine, in what Palestinians remember as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. And the most conservative figure here is that over 750,000 Palestinians became refugees, and the most conservative figure for how many were killed is 13,000. And these Palestinians, sort of in the process of expelling them, over 530 villages and towns were destroyed by the Zionist forces, which become called the Israeli military and Israeli defense forces, quote unquote, across the country, as you can see in the map here. And most of that population ends up in the refugee camps in the neighboring countries. The highest density of this refugee population is in a very tiny strip of land called the Gaza Strip, which comes under Egyptian control from 1948 to 1967. And the largest number total of Palestinian refugees end up in Jordan, where a very significant part of the population is Palestinian refugees. This is a photo of the largest Palestinian refugee camp in Jordan in the 1950s, Baqa refugee camp, which lies between Amman, the capital, and the northern border with Syria. And this is that refugee camp today. And so people have been in this camp. It's now 4th and 5th generation since they were expelled. The tents have been replaced by houses on which people have built on top of, with just higher and higher population density. However, about 150,000 Palestinians remain in what becomes the State of Israel. Because it's such a small number, they are given citizenship. And these become what we think of as the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And whenever we try to criticize Israel and call it an apartheid state, instead of talking about refugees and instead of talking about what happens after 1967 with the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, there becomes this fixation with Palestinian citizens of Israel because they're allowed to vote in Israeli elections and even to run for the Israeli parliament. So the people I'm going to talk about now are Palestinian citizens of Israel. This is the southern half of Palestine, or in Naqab, the Negev. So remember, these are people who hold Israeli citizenship.
Brother Hazem,
yes?
You have to
Please.
share your slides. You forgot to share them. Sorry.
Oh, you haven't seen the slides?
Yes, if you just
That's
share
unfortunate.
them. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no. Thank you for telling me. I wish I had been informed before. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes, brilliant.
Oh, so you didn't see any of what I was talking about earlier.
But
let me just kind of run through it.
I think very eloquent.
Okay. So this is just that 7% of the land is shaded in blue here. This is kind of the different districts and the population distribution in 1947, with only 1/3 of the population being kind of the Jewish, mostly refugees from the Holocaust. This is the Nakba and the villages and towns that were destroyed. The refugee camps and the density in the Gaza Strip. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but over here. And Jordan having the largest number. This is that Baqa refugee camp, the largest Palestinian refugee camp in Jordan in the 1950s. And here it is in the present. And this is what I wanted to be talking about now, which is the Naqab, the southern half of the country. Between 1948 and 1951, all of the Palestinians who lived in this area, which were around 115,000 Palestinians before 1948, were all expelled into Egypt, into the Gaza Strip. 30% of the Palestinian refugees in the Gaza Strip are from this area, into Jordan, and some of them also into the West Bank. Those who remained, about 15,000, were all squeezed into this area at the top where you see these blue dots and this dotted line. And this dotted line was kind of policed and turned into kind of barbed wire. And so Palestinians in this area called it Mantiqat al-Siyaj, the area of the fence, or the fenced area. So I want to talk about this area right here. So these are, again, Palestinian citizens of Israel. They carry Israeli citizenship and passports. They can vote and they can run for Israeli parliament, which is what's kind of given as the response when we say that Israel commits the crime of apartheid, even concerning its Palestinian citizens. So here I'm zooming into the area. And what happens in this area is that between 1948 and 1966, not just in this area, all Palestinians across what becomes the State of Israel, or what the kind of the dividing area between what becomes the State of Israel and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, becomes known as the Green Line. So sometimes you'll hear the phrase Israel inside of the Green Line, or within the Green Line, which is kind of what becomes Israel in 1948. And so all of the Palestinians within the Green Line between 1948 and 1967, they come to be governed by a separate body of law, which is Israeli military law. And this is remembered by Palestinians as the period of military rule. So that means that if you're a Jewish citizen, you are governed by laws passed by a parliament and enforced by police. If you are a Palestinian non-Jewish citizen, then you are not governed by police and laws passed by parliament. You are governed by laws passed by military commanders, military orders, they're called. And these military orders, the people who remember this period, remember them as a period of mobility restriction, that you required military permit just to leave the village or enter the village or neighborhood if you were living in a city. The real purpose of these military laws, however, was to confiscate land. So all the lands of the refugees were confiscated, and then all of the land, so you'd have these laws working in combination. So you'd have, for example, a military order which enabled the Israeli military to come into a village and say, all of your land is now under military control. This is a military risk zone. You all have to leave. And then another military order that says that any piece of land that is not used for 3 years, for example, not farmed for 3 years, becomes state property. And so they use one to expel the people from the village and its lands, and then another one after 3 years to announce to the villagers that your land has been confiscated. And in many of these cases, actually, Palestinians went to the Israeli courts and said, but it's not fair. We didn't farm the land because you expelled us from it. They said, that's not our business. You take that up with the military. That's the military order. So you have massive land confiscation continuing after 1948. Of course, this doesn't happen to any Jewish community. This is all exclusively targeted at Palestinian communities and Palestinian farmland and Palestinian grazing lands. And of course, there's a lot to say about all of this. I'm trying to kind of really condense it. The important point here is because I argue that the blueprint for what would also happen in the West Bank and Gaza Strip was actually tried out. The prototype was tried out here in what you're looking at in this map right now. Beginning in 1968, well, let me kind of rewind a little bit. In 1955, Israel passes one of its most important laws. It's a law called the Planning and Construction Law. And the Planning and Construction Law is a huge zoning law. It lists all of the cities and towns and farming communities and religious communities in Israel. And then zones them. It says, here's a residential area, here's an archaeological site. So it looks like a very boring zoning law. What's important about this law is that dozens of Palestinian villages are simply not mentioned in the law. And because the law is supposed to be comprehensive, what that means is that any community that's not mentioned doesn't exist. So overnight, as soon as this law is passed, all of the blue dots that you see in front of you, and then several other villages in the north, in the Galilee, cease to exist officially, which means they cease to show up on official maps. But it also meant that no more roads, no more educational institutions, no more health institutions, sewage, garbage collection, any kind of municipal or state service becomes illegal. Also illegal becomes construction. You're not allowed to build. There can't be any structures here because you can't zone for them. You can't have a zoning permit and a building permit in a place that doesn't exist. So these become known as the unrecognized villages. And those are the blue dots. Beginning in 1968, the Israelis developed the important part of this blueprint. And this is actually an idea came up with by Ariel Sharon, which was that we should start to recognize some of these communities. So the green blobs that you see here, like Rahat, Al-Lajiyya, Al-Hura, Tel Sabi', Tel Sheba, between 1968 and 1982, these 7 communities are recognized. Why, you might ask? And the reason is that what it means is if you live anywhere as a Palestinian, live anywhere outside of these recognized communities, then you are living in an illegally, because you're not allowed to build there, you're not allowed to be living there. And so the Israelis are consistently sending in soldiers there to destroy homes, destroy any kind of infrastructure. So when your home is demolished over and over again, because Palestinians continue to rebuild their houses, and still do, by the way, this is an ongoing struggle for the past 50 years. If you move into the concentration area, to the area where you're supposed to be squeezed in, the rikuzim, which is the kind of Hebrew word for concentration, then you can live legally. But as I will show you in the photos, you are no longer able to farm your land or to graze your sheep or to live that kind of lifestyle. You have to become a cheap worker, an exploitable worker in the Israeli factories and industrial areas, which are in pink. So this, for example, is Wadi Naam. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but it's right here on this map. And the industrial zone I'll show you is over here. So this is Wadi Naam. When I visited it about 10 years ago, there were 6,000 Palestinian citizens of Israel. All of these houses that you see, and there's many more on the other side of that power plant, they don't have electricity, they don't have water, they don't have any, if you call an ambulance, it can't come here. You have to go meet it out on the highway. But even though they don't have power, the main power generator for the huge industrial zone nearby is right in the middle of their village. There's a water main that also connects the industrial area. They're not allowed to have any access to that water, but it runs right underneath the village. All of the houses in the village have been destroyed repeatedly. almost every week or two, there are home demolitions in the unrecognized villages. And that, kind of just west of it, is that industrial zone which produces chemicals. 98% of the year, the winds in Palestine blow from the sea, from the Mediterranean, so they blow from the west. So all of the toxic emissions from this industrial zone go into Wadi Naam, into the village, and 100% of the villagers are ill with skin disease, respiratory disease, genital illnesses. And so you regularly, if you kind of come to the unrecognized villages, you will regularly see the effects of the home demolitions, which are, again, weekly to bi-weekly. And if you find any area where people are building with more, with kind of stone, and you see minarets of the mosques, you know that you're looking at one of the concentration townships, or the Rikuzim. I'm going to kind of skip ahead. But just to say that the concentration towns, because they're recognized, they actually do make it into Israeli statistics. They are the poorest communities in Israel by Israel's own statistics, even though you have some of the wealthiest communities by Israel's own statistics as their neighbors. So this here in the distance is the Israeli settlement of Omer. You can this is kind of desert climate. So the fact that there's this lush green is because of the exploitation of water. Meanwhile, just a few kind of yards away is the edges of Tel Sheva, which is the poorest community in all of Israel. No access to water, no access to electricity. So this is what I'm talking about when I talk about maximum land, minimum Palestinians, because that also translates into those Palestinians that are here. We need the maximum number of those Palestinians squeezed into the smallest area of land. So these green blobs, these recognized villages or concentration towns, these are immensely packed, densely packed, with terrible, terrible living conditions. But that's the choice you have to make as a Palestinian citizen of Israel in this area, is to live somewhere with your own way of life where you're able to farm, to graze your sheep, and to kind of actually, breathe the air, or to move into the concentration towns where you live a very miserable life, detached from any source of livelihood, except to go and work for an Israeli factory for peanuts. This gets exported into the West Bank and Gaza Strip as a system with the occupation in 1967, 1970. Right away after the occupation in 1967, one of the top Israeli generals and ministers, a man named Yigal Allon, develops a plan for how to deal with this much larger Palestinian population that now came under Israeli military control. And his proposal was to split the West Bank into two parts by extending Jerusalem down to the Dead Sea with a huge settler colony called Ma'ali Adumim, which continues to be the largest Israeli settler colony or settlement in the occupied West Bank. And so to split the West Bank into a northern area, this yellow one up here that includes Ramallah, Nablus, etc., and a southern area that includes Bethlehem and Al-Khalil or Hebron. And notice that the idea here is to split the West Bank from access to a border with another Arab country. And the same with Gaza, to split Gaza from any access to Egypt by confiscating the area on that border. And this gets developed over the course of the 1970s and 80s, most famously by Ariel Sharon, who says, why split the West Bank into two parts when we can try to take control over all of the hilltops and split it into many more parts, into little pockets, like we did in the Negev, in the Naqab. Now, the main issue here is that if you're going to do this, it's very expensive to continue to police these Palestinians using the Israeli military. It's very, very costly. And so the solution that Sharon came up with, or tried to come up with, was to find a Palestinian leadership that could govern the Palestinians on Israel's behalf. And this is exactly taken from the South African apartheid playbook, where the South African indigenous population was all squeezed into the Bantustans. And I want to show you, you see this picture of apartheid South Africa. You see these, you have 90 or 87% of South Africa, which is shaded in white here, was all reserved for the white population, which was 10% of the population. And the Black and indigenous and colored community was to be squeezed into what became known as the homelands or the Bantustans. And you can see them here in these different colors, Transkei, Ciskei, Botswana, etc. And so it was exactly this. And each of these homelands was governed by a local South African indigenous leadership that became the kind of first line of defense for the Israeli apartheid regime, for the South African apartheid regime. So the Israeli regime tried to replicate this. They tried to find a compliant, pliant, collaborating Palestinian leadership from the late 70s and early 80s that would govern Palestinians, police the Palestinians on behalf of Israel, and be Israel's first line of defense. At the time, this was called the Village Leagues, which is what I wrote my master's dissertation about. And if you have any questions about it, I'm happy to answer any of those questions. The short version of this, however, is that this failed miserably. The West Bank and Gaza Strip, including Palestinians in 48, and at the time there was an uprising in the Golan Heights, which was occupied from Syria in 1967 by Israel. There was a huge uprising, and it made this fail completely. Nobody collaborated, and the few who did collaborate with the Israelis to try to become this native authority, they were completely excommunicated. Hopefully somebody answers that. The main obstacle, the main slogan that they raised was that you, Israel, you can't pick our political leadership and representative. We already have a political leadership and representative. That's the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. So that's our representative, and that's who you have to talk to. You don't get to pick one for us. And so Israel learned a very valuable lesson from this, which was that the only way to create a pliant Palestinian leadership that would govern on Israel's behalf, but also be acceptable to Palestinians, would have to be through the transformation of the PLO itself, which they managed to do in the early 1990s with what became the Oslo Agreements. The Oslo Agreements effectively transformed the Palestine Liberation Organization into the Bantustan Authority of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. They transformed the key organization that represented the struggle and the resistance that aimed at the actual liberation of Palestine and the return of the refugees, and turned it into the prison warden working on their behalf. And this is what the Oslo Accords are. It was actually a straight up copy and paste job of the early 1980s Sharon Plan, Village Leagues plan that I was talking about. And under the Oslo Accords, as you can see in this map, Palestinian control came to be over these very tiny peach-shaded areas, which became called Area A, which were the high Palestinian population density areas in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And then there were these Area B, which are shaded in green, which is where a lot of the villages are and a lot of the village lands are. And then most of the West Bank turned into and in Area B, that land was to come under Palestinian civil control. So the Palestinian Authority was to kind of run things like the schools and the sewage system. But any policing, any security control remained in the hands of Israel. And then Area C, which counts for over 55% of the area of the West Bank, which is shaded in white here on the West Bank. And this was under complete Israeli control. And until today, it's under complete Israeli control, as is Area B. And the Area A, even though it's under ostensibly, supposedly under Palestinian Authority control, the Israeli forces, if they want to arrest someone in there, they just go in and arrest them. And they actually call, this is called security collaboration or security coordination. The Israeli military would actually call up the Palestinian police. So when I was living in Bethlehem, you knew the Israelis were going to conduct a raid when you'd see the Palestinian police disappear. The Palestinian police just go and disappear into their barracks. Then the Israeli comes in with their tanks and jeeps, arrest whoever they want to arrest, and then they leave, and then the Palestinian police come back out. This is what the peace process meant in the West Bank and Gaza Strip during the 1990s and early 2000s. I'm going to kind of close up here. Anyway, there's obviously a lot to say. I'm just going to give you a little kind of zoom in here. This is Qalqilia. This is one of the Palestinian towns in the north of the West Bank. Qalqilia sits on one of the largest, if not the largest, underground water aquifer in the West Bank. And so for about 3,000 to 4,000 years, Qalqilia was exporting fruits and vegetables to the rest of the region, as far as Egypt, Syria, and so on. In 2003, Israel completed the construction of the wall that surrounded Qalqilia completely. And so now the villagers and the townspeople of Qalqilia could no longer access their farmland. And so for the first time, and since 2003, Qalqilia has to import fruits and vegetables. This is an old picture. The houses now extend all the way right up to the wall. And what I want you to remember is that idea of maximum Palestinians squeezed into the minimum amount of land. The other thing I want you to note is there's only one entrance and exit to Qalqilia. You can see it in the satellite image and you can see it in the map. One Israeli soldier can close that gate and transform Qalqilia into an open-air prison. And of course, there's the world's largest open-air prison, which is the Gaza Strip. And as you can see, it's completely sealed off from the rest of the world, with Israel controlling all of these land borders as well as the entire sea, and then a kind of Israeli-Egyptian cooperation over ensuring that the Egyptian side of the border, the Sinai side of the border, also remains shut, and only people who are acceptable to Egypt and Israel are able to move in and out. And so it's that same logic of concentrating the largest number of Palestinians into these open-air prisons. Now, I want you to remember, when we talk about Palestinian citizens of Israel, I talked about the south, about the Naqab or Negev, but wherever you go, even if you see something like this, the only difference between this and what we saw in the West Bank or in Gaza is there's no physical wall, but there's actually an invisible wall here, because any Palestinian who builds outside of their village, even though they're citizens of Israel and even if they own the land, the Israeli authorities will ensure that that is destroyed. So this man on the right here, he worked as a cleaner for 30 years, saving up to build a house. This is al-Fahim in the distance. It's one of the largest Palestinian citizens of Israel towns, cities actually, inside the Green Line. He saved up for 30 years, built a 2-story house. The Israeli authorities, the police and the army would come by, they would see him building. He finished the house, he furnished the house, he painted the house. They slept one night in the house, and the next day the Israeli police came and destroyed the house. There's an invisible wall. Fahim, because it's a Palestinian town, has an invisible wall around it. And any Palestinian who tries, even though they're a citizen and can vote and can run for parliament, if they try to build and expand these Palestinian communities, immediately it's destroyed, because it's maximum Palestinians inside the ghetto, maximum land under exclusive Jewish control by the state, effectively, with the minimum number of Palestinians, so that gradually, or quickly, these Palestinians try to find another place to live and to migrate out, or move into the concentration areas where Israel can keep control and a very small group of soldiers can just contain them in those ghettos. The thing that enables this to continue is that Israel is an ally of some of the most powerful countries in the world, including the UK, United States, Europe, and so on, and increasingly among Arab and Muslim countries as well. Today, Israel's system of apartheid is being held up as a model by racists who support such people as Donald Trump and whatnot, who want to have white supremacy or kind of Hindutva in India, who want one kind of people to be the supreme and everybody else to be below. Israel has become a model for how to do that kind of legally, in a way that's acceptable to the international community. Meanwhile, Israel continues to do everything it wants to do: confiscate land, destroy houses, quash dissent, continue to implement an apartheid regime, violate human rights on a daily basis. And the international community talks about this 2-state solution, which is effectively no more than a smokescreen for simply the continuation of Israeli violations of international law and the commission of crimes against humanity. For people in the UK and abroad, one of the most powerful things we can do is stop this impunity. Stop saying that stop allowing for it to be normal to buy weapons from Israel and sell weapons to Israel, to do business with Israel as if it were just a normal country. It is not. It is a state that is committing the crime of apartheid. It's a settler colonial regime. It's committing crimes against humanity on a daily basis. And legally, there's an obligation for all institutions, not just state institutions, but also municipal, county, companies. They have a legal obligation, because Israel is committing crimes against humanity. They have a legal obligation to do everything in their power to stop these crimes from being committed. And that's why we talk about boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. Because what that is to say, we are not going to do business with you until you cease the commission of these crimes, until you are actually a normal place that doesn't commit crimes against humanity. We will not treat you as a normal place, and so we won't buy your agricultural products, we won't do military business with you, and we won't allow your orchestras and your official military ballet companies to come and perform as if there's nothing going on. The Jewish National Fund, which I said now has remarketed and rebranded itself as an environmental organization, and is the cornerstone of Israeli apartheid in land, is a charity in the UK, and in 51 other countries actually. So the taxpayer money goes to subsidize the work of the Jewish National Fund to build and expand parks on the destroyed Palestinian villages and to enforce the system of apartheid in land. So I hope I haven't spoken for too long. But I'll stop here so that we have time for some discussion and some
Thank
questions.
you very much, Brother Hazem. I didn't want to stop you, actually. You have double your time, but it doesn't matter.
Oh,
but
I do that
you're very
sometimes.
good, and I think you provided a very good synopsis of the crisis the Palestinians face and how Israel operates. For me, I think the takeaway message from you was the fact that from the very first definition, you mentioned that it's a domination of one group over the other. If we look at it from that perspective, considering apartheid, then Israel was an apartheid state at the time of its own inception, because the
100%.
very idea is to dominate the other, the Palestinians in this case. And therefore, I think we shouldn't see Israeli apartheid as something that has emerged now or it's something new, but the very concept itself is. And I think that sits in very well with the other idea you're talking about, settler colonialism, because the logic of settler colonialism is genocide. You have to create the genocide of the indigenous people, not of only people, but of the culture, their epistemology, the very idea of who they are as a people must be erased. They should be removed and they should be never thought of. And they themselves should not be able to speak about themselves. And that's a two-way process. So Brother Hazem, there's the other thing that I need to sort of pass on and sort of elaborate on, that Israel itself would claim that we operate in a different regime. And for me, I would like to break that down in 4 areas. What you mentioned, the Green Line, what is Palestinian citizens of Israel. And then we have the West Bank. Then West Bank and Gaza, we can put it as one block. How it operates there is different, as you mentioned, area A, B, C, and Oslo Accord. And then how Palestinians are treated in East Jerusalem is also very different. And then, of course, we have the dimension that very few people talk about is the refugees. Because again, there's a law, Israel's invisible law, as you mentioned, that stops them coming back to their homes. The return is not possible for them. So if you want to elaborate on this different aspect, because what I want to get through here is that people need to understand that because they operate in different structures and there's different level of oppression, it doesn't mean it's not oppressing and it's not an apartheid way of thinking it. Maybe you'd like to expand on that.
Yes, sure. So I'll kind of reverse the order. The original sin, if you will, the initial crime that Israel committed was the expulsion of the refugees and the denial of their return. And it's actually not as invisible or as invisible as we might think. It's actually written into the laws. There are laws to deny the return. So other than military policy, which was to shoot on sight anyone that they called infiltrators, any refugees trying to enter, which we have very amply documented, we also have laws that say that refugees are not permitted to return. And we have consistent action, even into the present, to ensure that any kind of even peace deal is very, very almost impossible for that peace deal to include refugee return, and these are passed democratically by the Israeli parliament. So like I said, any violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the context of trying to maintain this regime of domination, this racist regime of domination, would be crime of apartheid. And I've actually written an article specifically about this. The denial of return is, so you have a right under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is everybody has the right to leave their country and to return to their country. And so Israel has very clearly been violating this human right in the context of, we don't want these non-Jews coming in because that would affect the demographics and affect our ability to have this regime of domination. So just by denying me my return to Palestine, in that context, even if it did nothing else, this is already the crime of apartheid. But remember, the vast majority of all Palestinians are displaced persons and refugees. 7 out of 10 Palestinians are refugees and displaced persons, internally displaced. And the vast majority of those are refugees. And let's remember that even the vast majority of for example, when I say that Gaza is 2/3 refugees, these are refugees who are within 20-minute drive from their homes. In 20 minutes, if we think of Gaza as a problem, we can solve this problem in 20 minutes with enough buses. Everybody can be back in their ancestral villages and in their homes, most of which are not occupied by Israelis now. The vast majority not occupied by Israelis now. The one reason that Palestinians aren't allowed to cross that 20-minute drive and go home is because they're not Jewish. If they could be fit under the legal definition of Jewishness under the Israeli law, then they would be allowed to go home. And I think this really encapsulates, more than anything else, the apartheid and institutionalized racism of this regime. So this is the refugees, and the refugees are kind of all over the neighboring countries. And keep in mind, we have refugees displaced from, inside the Green Line who are now refugees in Gaza. We have refugees from inside the Green Line who are refugees in the West Bank. So every major Palestinian city in the West Bank, including Jerusalem, has refugee camps. And most refugees don't live in the camps. They live in the towns and in the cities. So even when we go to Jordan or to Lebanon or to Syria, there are refugee camps, very large refugee camps. In Lebanon, you have a refugee camp like Ain al-Hilwa is upwards of 100,000 people. The same with, now it's been destroyed, but in Damascus, the Yarmouk refugee camp was massive. Again, over 140, 150,000 Palestinians. But most refugees don't live in the camps. They've moved into the towns and cities and live in the neighborhoods and so on. When we kind of zoom in a little bit further, Jerusalem has a very particular status. So half of the city of Jerusalem was occupied in 1948, and that suffered the fate of all of the areas occupied in 1948, which is all of those inhabitants became refugees. What became East Jerusalem, because it fell on the east side of that kind of armistice line, that's remained under sort of Jordanian control and remained very much a Palestinian city, and remains to this day the largest Palestinian city in the West Bank. It's larger than Nablus or Al-Khalil. Because of the special status of Jerusalem, because the Israelis were very intent on unifying the city of Jerusalem in 1967 when they occupied the West Bank militarily, it would be too complicated that they weren't able to expel all of these Palestinians in what became East Jerusalem. So these Palestinians remained in Jerusalem. They couldn't be given citizenship because that would upset the demographic balance and the racism of the state and the apartheid nature of the state. And so what Israel did was it gave them an in-between status. It gave them residency. So it's as if they are residents of Israel, but not citizens. So they can't vote, they can't run for parliament, they have a different colored ID card. And if they leave Jerusalem for too long, or if they get a job somewhere else, or their center of life, as the Israelis call it, moves to another place, then they will be stripped of that residency. So they become kind of denationalized and lose their Jerusalem ID. And if you don't have a Jerusalem ID, you can, because of now the checkpoint and wall system, you're physically stopped by the Israeli military and this infrastructure of apartheid, which is mostly the wall and the settlements, from physically entering. And if you're caught inside, you're arrested and you will go to jail. So that's kind of the special status of Jerusalem, and it's a very harsh and difficult struggle, because these are impoverished communities that are right at the front lines of Israeli control, living in a city with Jewish Israelis who see themselves as a kind of superior people, and heavily over-policed, with their education system gutted, and their identity being kind of affected on a daily basis. And they are kind of custodians of things like the Jerusalem Old City, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, and so on. And so they are custodians of these globally important places, not just for any one religion or another. And yet you have these settlers who are coming in intent on taking this land, especially in the Old City, and especially in Al-Haram al-Sharif, or the noble sanctuary where Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock are. Then you have the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And though they are both the 1967 occupied territories, in the last 10 years they're actually very different in a very harsh way as well. In the West Bank, I kind of described how we have, like I showed you, that kind of open air prison of Qalqilia, with all of the lands outside of the ghettos, outside of the walled areas, being confiscated. But for the most part, people are able to move in and out through the checkpoints, and food and things are able to move in and out, if anything is moving out, through these checkpoints. But the Israelis maintain that power to stop it at any time. So when you had the Intifada and the uprising and the Israelis wanted to close them down, they were very quickly able to close them down. What makes Gaza particularly different now is it has only been closed down since 2007. It's been in a state of complete siege and closure with Israelis. I mean, the Israelis have said that they basically calculated how many calories it takes to keep a human being alive, multiplied that by the number of people living in Gaza, and they allow that many calories into the Gaza Strip. They've created lists of things that could be used for terrorism that include, pasta and other like extremely innocuous things. Medicines aren't allowed inside, and so you have people aren't allowed to seek medical treatment. People get accepted into universities and get scholarships outside and aren't able to leave. Plus, every 2 to 3 years, we have a major Israeli military assault that destroys large parts of the Gaza Strip and kills hundreds, if not thousands, of people. And so it's a really, really urgent, it has been for 10 years, an extremely urgent and drastic situation. This is not to mention the mental health toll and the effect on children and our early childhood of living in the most densely populated area in the world, where your calories are being counted for how much food comes in, where there's no access to the sea. Oftentimes the water and the air is poisoned and polluted and actually toxic. Plus, every 2 to 3 years, there's a major military assault. It's an entirely traumatized population in its entirety, with no exceptions, and nothing is being done about this. And then last but not least is the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who I think I spoke about enough. Of course, there's a lot more to say about the banning of marriage with other Palestinians who are not from 48, the gutting of the educational system, the hyper-policing.
Sorry, I just want to try and address one myth, because we only got 3 minutes left, or 3 to 5 minutes.
Oh.
A Zionist perspective would be say, look, we have Arab in the Knesset members. In 1999, I think it was, or 2019, Miss Israel was an Arab. This is one of the things. How would you counter that? I mean, an pro-Israeli would say, look, we are not apartheid. How come all these Palestinians are enjoying so much in our land?
Yeah, and I think, that was really in many ways one of the main thrusts of my presentation. I talked about the unrecognized villages. I talked about the ongoing land confiscation. I just mentioned the hyper-policing, the gutting of the education system, the destruction of Palestinian culture, and even criminalization of Palestinian culture. You have, the extremely high carceral rates, so prison rates. The vast majority are people of Palestinian origin. And then you have just the issue where, like, think about institutionalized discrimination against Black Americans. I think because of the power of US popular culture, many of the people listening to this should be quite aware, or the the institutionalized discrimination about Muslims in the UK and Blacks in the UK. This kind of thing doesn't prevent someone from becoming famous. It doesn't prevent a singular individual from being tokenized or from somehow kind of getting through the cracks and becoming. It's not about that one individual who becomes a Miss Israel or a member of the Supreme Court. It's about what politics do they have to do to become a member of the establishment. The Israeli laws are actually very clear. If you want to have a political party that runs for the Knesset, which is Israel's parliament, then they cannot challenge the Jewish character of the state. So you're actually not allowed to have a political party that says any of what I just said in my presentation, that this is an apartheid regime. You can't have a political party or a politician who can legally run for the Knesset who says this is an apartheid regime. And those who have been arrested, have been exiled, and have had their status stripped. And have some of them, those who have been exiled, it's because they have warrants out for their arrest, like Dr. Hazem Jamjoum, who's now in Doha. And if we look at like who are the Palestinian, who is the Palestinian who made it to the Israeli Supreme Court, we find that they are a Zionist, right? We find that this is a person who has nothing to do with challenging the Israeli regime in any way, shape, or form. And is actually more regressive than some of the Jewish Israelis who sit alongside him on the court. You have Palestinian citizens of Israel who serve in the Israeli military. Some of them are forcibly recruited, who are from the Druze community in particular, and others who, like if you don't serve in the army, you miss out actually, because the Israeli society, the Israeli kind of institutions, premise a lot of the services that you get, including scholarships to university, including the kinds of like state services that you'll get, on the fact that you've done military service. And so that actually creates a massive, almost like coercive push for people to enter into the Israeli military. And some of them, they'll finish their military service, come back home and find their house has been demolished, by a unit that they may even have served in. Right? This is the kind of craziness that is the apartheid state of Israel.
Law that was passed, basic nation law passed, I think it's 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, which also categorically differentiates Jewish nature of Israel and undermines everything to do with anybody else, the Gentiles. And I think that is also very, very important. Brother Hazem, you've been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for your time and your knowledge and your feed into the crisis that Palestinians face. And you also touched upon the BDS movement for students to carry on. And I think it's something that students must champion wherever they are in their universities, to make sure that the universities divest both intellectual engagement as well as material engagement with anything to do with Israel. I think it's very, very
institutions.
Absolutely. And there is a lot of collaboration, especially in the science field, with Israeli arms company and so forth. And I think we have to be very vigilant about that. And it's something we have to champion. I keep on saying every time I speak that those who work on the Palestinian issue have a higher moral ground. And I think we have to be able to take that on board and be able to be bold enough to present our case once we are well informed. And Hazem, thank you very much. And thank you very much to all our listeners for joining us. Thank you very much for being with us. Assalamu alaikum.
Okay. Alaikum salam. Thank you, Dr. Badil.